I was a scientist, studying rare animals, writing articles, but one day I realized that the animals I was studying needed protection, not observation. That's how I ended up in one of Russia's toughest nature reserves. My name is Victor Hayes, and for the last 7 years I have been working as a senior inspector in the Zaysky State Nature Reserve. Before that, I was a regular zoological biologist, conducting research, writing scientific articles, and participating in conferences. My specialization was monitoring populations of rare species in the mountain taiga. I regularly came to the Zaya Reserve for field research, and each time I felt more and more acutely that scientific observations alone were not enough. Poachers, black diggers, illegal tourists. The reserve needed real protection, not just scientific reports. The decision was not easy. I had a wife, a 12-year-old daughter, and a stable job at the Institute. But in 2007, when I was 38 years old, I applied for the position of senior inspector in the reserve. My family supported me, even though it meant frequent and long separations. The Zaya Reserve is not just an area of wilderness. It is 99.4 thousand hectares of mountain taiga, where altitude differences reach 1,400 meters. Here, on the slopes of the Tukaringra Ridge, nature has created a unique ecosystem where Siberian taiga and Manchurian flora neighbor. In summer, the temperature can rise up to plus 38 degrees Celsius, and in winter it can drop down to minus 48 degrees Celsius. The off-season is the most treacherous time when the weather changes unpredictably and the animals become especially dangerous. My site covers the eastern part of the reserve, the most inaccessible and poorly studied part. Every day I make rounds, check camera traps, make observations, and write reports. In my backpack, I always have a carbine, radio, compass, first aid kit, food and water, matches, and a waterproof package. Over the years, I have learned to read animal tracks better than scientific articles and to understand the weather more accurately than any weather forecast. But the main thing I have realized during my work is that the reserve does not forgive mistakes. Every wrong decision, every misstep can cost a life, yours or someone else's. I want to tell you about 5 cases from my practice that taught me this. They happened at different times, but each of them left its mark, both in the history of the reserve and in my own. The first of them happened in the cold fall of 2008, when 2 inexperienced hikers decided to take a shortcut through the reserve. I didn't know then that a simple search and rescue operation would turn into a race with death in the wild taiga. The call came in at approximately 1940. A group of hikers from Blagoveshchensk reported that 2 of their companions had not returned to the parking lot. Eric and Natalie, both in their 30s, decided to take a shortcut through the eastern sector of the reserve to catch the last bus. They had minimal gear with them, just small backpacks with snacks and water. They had to be back by 1700, but their phones had been out of range for several hours. The weather was deteriorating rapidly. Gusty winds brought heavy clouds, and the temperature was dropping. The weather station was predicting snow by midnight, the first of the season. For unprepared people, a night in the taiga in sub-zero temperatures could be their last. I requested support from the nearest search and rescue team, but they could arrive only by morning. It was impossible to wait. I quickly packed my backpack, extra flashlights, warm blankets, radio, first aid kit, thermos with hot tea, flares. The map showed 3 possible routes the hikers could take through the reserve. Experience suggested that they would choose the shortest one, through the Medveji Pass. At 2015, I was already on the trail, lighting the way with a headlamp. The cold wind was blowing in my face, carrying the first snowflakes. Somewhere in the distance, an owl screeched alarmingly. The trail on the wet ground confirmed my hunch. They had indeed gone over the pass. But further on, the path was bifurcated. One trail led through a dense cedar forest, the other along a rocky lean-to. I stopped, studying the crumpled grass. 2 men. One of them seemed to be limping on his right leg. The trail was deeper on one side. They went through the cedar forest. It was their first mistake. In the dark, it was easy to lose direction among the dense trees. After an hour of climbing, I found their first camping place, moss, a chocolate bar wrapper. Here they were still walking steadily, but further on, the tracks began to loop. The tourists obviously lost their orientation, and ahead was the most dangerous section, a system of rock ledges, where one wrong step could be the last. My shout echoed off the rocks, but there was only silence in response. The snow fell harder, covering our tracks. Time was working against us. Suddenly, something red flashed in the lantern light. My heart twitched, a scrap of a jacket on a sharp rock ledge. I shone the light down. There, about 5 meters away on a rocky platform, I could see a backpack. "Hey, can anyone hear me?" A faint female voice came in reply from somewhere below. The flashlight beam caught Natalie out of the darkness. She was sitting on a narrow ledge, huddled against the rock. Eric lay next to her, unconscious, his head resting in her lap. We snapped. Eric hit his head. "I can't get him up, and it's too dangerous to go any further down." Her voice shook with cold and fear. There was no time to think. I took a safety rope out of my backpack and securely fastened it to the trunk of an old cedar tree. The descent took a few minutes. Eric was alive, but seriously injured, a deep cut on his head, possibly a concussion. Natalie was bruised but cold. They had been on the ledge for over 2 hours. The climb was a real challenge. Natalie could barely stand on her feet. Erica had to lift her up on her own, using a system of blocks. Every meter was difficult. The snow was falling harder and harder, turning the rocks into slippery traps. At 2340, we finally made it to the top. I quickly unfolded a rescue blanket and took out a thermos. While Natalie drank hot tea, I treated Erica's wound. Fortunately, the bleeding had already stopped. I injected some painkillers from the first aid kit and applied a bandage. He started to regain consciousness, but he was too weak to move around on his own. I pulled out my radio and phone. I had to coordinate with several services at once. The rescuers had already left town and were about 2 hours away from the eastern boundary of the reserve. After a short discussion, we decided to go the opposite way. They would go from the dirt road through Block 47, and we would come down to meet them on the hunting trail. This was to shorten the time until Ericom received professional medical attention by at least an hour and a half. The hospital in Zaya confirmed readiness to receive the injured man. The surgeon on duty had already been alerted. The reserve management provided additional transportation for the evacuation. The way back was difficult. The snow had already covered the ground with a dense layer of several centimeters. We had to carefully choose each step. I went first, trampling a path in the fresh snow. Natalie held onto my backpack. Together, we supported Erica. Every 15 minutes, I contacted the rescuers, adjusting my route. The rendezvous occurred at dawn at an old hunting ranch. Professional rescuers quickly moved Erica onto a stretcher. A medic immediately placed an IV and performed a more thorough examination. Natalie was also examined, given dry clothes and hot drink. Later, already from the hospital, came the confirmation. Erica indeed had a concussion, but thanks to timely help and proper transportation, serious complications were avoided. This case taught me a lot. In the work of a gamekeeper, the main thing is not just to know the terrain and be able to navigate. It is important to anticipate, calculate options, understand the logic of people in trouble. Then you have a chance to get ahead of trouble. But that was just the beginning. In the spring of 2010, I encountered a phenomenon that made me question all my scientific knowledge about the behavior of wild animals. By the end of March, the snow in the reserve began to actively melt. Daytime temperatures were up to plus 5 degrees Celsius, and at night it was barely below freezing. At this time of year, animals usually behave predictably. Bears come out of hibernation. Ungulates descend to the valleys for the first greenery, and the breeding season for birds begins. My usual route was through the eastern sector of the reserve, where I checked camera traps and recorded animal tracks. On March 27th, passing by the slope of Kami Staya Rock, I noticed something unusual. A large group of about 15 musk oxen stood motionless, looking at one point. It was strange. Usually at this time they were actively feeding. I took out my binoculars and started observing. In 10 minutes, several more roe deer joined the group, then a family of wild boars. They showed neither aggression nor fear of each other. They just stood and looked toward the mountain range. As a biologist, I had never encountered such behavior. In my field diary, I recorded the time, coordinates, and composition of the unusual gathering. I decided to stay and observe. By evening, the number of animals only increased. Wolves appeared, but they did not show hunting interest. Moreover, they took a position near potential victims. At night, I settled down in a hunting tent nearby. In the light of the full moon, the picture seemed almost fantastic. Predators and herbivores gathered together as if waiting for something. Toward morning, the first signs of restlessness appeared. The animals began to shift from foot to sniff. Some made anxious noises. At 5:40 a.m., the earth shook slightly. Seismic activity is not rare for our places, but the animals reacted strangely. As if on command, they turned around and quickly, but without panic, moved towards the valley. An hour after they left, I felt a stronger tremor. I turned on the radio and contacted the weather station. They confirmed that a series of small earthquakes had been recorded in the area, but what happened next exceeded all expectations. By noon, a large landslide came down from the top of the ridge, completely blocking one of the mountain gorges. Had the animals stayed in their usual places, many could have died. In the evening, while reviewing the notes, I was reminded of my university research on the ability of animals to anticipate natural disasters. But it was one thing to read about it in scientific journals, and quite another to see with my own eyes how different species, forgetting their natural enmity, came together and moved away from danger. Over the next week, I watched as the animals gradually returned to their familiar territories. All but the wolf pack had gone to the northern part of the reserve. It was as if something told them that the southern sector was still unsafe. I was right. 3 days later, a second landslide, even more powerful than the first, came down. But by then, all the animals had left the danger zone. It made me rethink a lot of what I knew about wild animals. Perhaps they have senses and abilities that we humans have long lost, or perhaps never had. And sometimes it's just worth it to observe and learn from them. But all my reflections on the natural wisdom of animals were overshadowed in the summer of 2011, when uninvited guests appeared in the reserve, interested in not natural phenomena at all. The middle of August 2011 was unusually hot and dry. Indian summer came earlier than usual, bringing cloudless skies and daytime heat of 30 degrees. In such weather, I preferred to start my detour at dawn, while the sun was still in full force. On August 15th, my route took me through the northeastern sector of the reserve, which was dominated by old cedar forests mixed with oak groves, ideal habitat for ginseng. Local hunters had reported suspicious activity in the area twice in recent weeks, but no obvious signs of intruders had yet been found. At 7 a.m., climbing up to a small plateau, I noticed the first signs. The grass was crumpled in an unusual pattern, as if someone had methodically combed the area. I took out my GPS navigator and marked a point. Moving on, I found several more similar areas. Now there was no doubt. Someone was systematically surveying the area in search of ginseng. Old gamekeepers told me that black diggers use special tactics. They work in groups of 3 or 4 people, carefully camouflage their tracks, and never set up permanent camps. Ginseng root on the black market can be worth a lot of money, especially if it is more than 15 years old. And in our reserve, there were older specimens. By noon, I came to a small gully, hidden from prying eyes by a dense growth of young cedars. Here the picture was different. obvious traces of a parking lot, a fireplace, neatly covered with earth, and the main thing, several characteristic holes from dug roots. I took out the navigator again, made notes, and photographed the tracks. Suddenly, a shadow flashed in the bushes. I froze, listening to the sounds of the forest. The silence seemed unnatural. No birds, no small animals. Only the light rustling of leaves in the wind. Slowly, I pulled out my binoculars and began to survey the surroundings. On the opposite slope, about 300 meters away, I noticed movement. A human figure was moving quickly between the trees, obviously not wanting to be seen. Ducking down, I began to slowly move to the edge of the hollow, where the vegetation was denser. The walkie-talkie on my belt beeped quietly. The duty officer was requesting a scheduled communication session. I had to ignore the call. Now it was more important to understand how many intruders were in the forest and where their main camp was. Following the barely visible animal trail, I climbed higher up the slope, where I could get a better view. And I was not mistaken. About half a kilometer away, in a small cleft, I could see the tents. Professional outfit, special equipment for digging and transporting roots. I counted 4 men, all of sturdy build. One with a hunting knife on his belt was constantly looking around. He took out a camera with a long lens and began to record the situation. At that moment, the radio came to life again, louder now. The observer instantly reacted to the sound, turning sharply in my direction. We stared into each other's eyes for a few seconds. Then he shouted something to the others. The camp went into motion. The intruders began hastily packing up their gear. There was no time to think. In 15 minutes they could disappear with all the evidence. I turned on the radio. Quadrant 32B, a group of poachers, 4 men, presumably armed. We need immediate backup. Then, with the bolt of my carbine cocked defiantly, I announced loudly, "You are surrounded. This is a protected area. Drop your gear and come out with your hands up." 2 of them froze on the spot. 1 rushed to run. But the leader, the one with the knife, suddenly rushed straight at me. In his eyes I could see the determination of a man who had nothing to lose. I managed to get out of the line of attack, but the blade still brushed my jacket. A struggle ensued. He was clearly trained, but I had a lot of experience in field expeditions. We clashed, rolled down the slope. At some point I managed to use a painful hold. The knife flew aside. Out of the corner of my eye I noticed movement. Police officers were already running towards us, having arrived in time to respond to my call. Later, 37 ginseng roots were found in the camp, some of them more than 25 years old. At black market prices, several million rubles. But it wasn't about money. Each such root is the result of decades of development of a natural system. To destroy it is like tearing a page out of an ancient book, which no one will ever be able to restore. As it turned out, we caught a large gang, which was harvesting ginseng throughout the Far East. For me, this detention became an important lesson. The work of a gamekeeper is not only the observation of nature, but also the willingness to protect it, risking their own safety. However, the real test was ahead of me. The following fall, I had to make a choice between my duty as a conservationist and my instinct for self-preservation, and that choice nearly cost me my life. The fall of 2012 taught me a lesson I will never forget. It started as a routine call about poachers, but turned into something much more dangerous. On October 12th, around 6 p.m., I received a call from local hunters. A suspicious group with guns had been spotted in the Falcon Ridge area. At this time of year, legal hunting is prohibited there. It's the elk rutting season. Usually I don't go out at night, but the information was alarming. Eyewitnesses reported shots. I got ready in 15 minutes. Carbine, radio, night vision device, flashlight, first aid kit. Taking into account the remoteness of the area, I took a sleeping bag and provisions in case I had to spend the night in the forest. It was about 12 kilometers to the supposed place over a difficult, rugged terrain. By the time I reached the square, It was already dark. The moon was barely breaking through the dense cloud cover. In such weather, poachers often use searchlights for night hunting. Blinded animals freeze, becoming an easy target. I discovered the intruders around 9 p.m. 3 men, 2 off-road vehicles camouflaged under old cedars. In the back of one vehicle was something large, covered with a tarp. Started to approach cautiously, keeping in the shade of the trees. Suddenly the silence was broken by the sound of a gunshot, followed by the desperate cry of a musk deer. Through my night vision device, I saw a large shadow flicker 200 meters away from the poacher's camp. Another shot, and the animal collapsed to the ground. I froze, assessing the situation. I determined from the silhouette that it was a female elk. And then I noticed something that made my heart clench. A small figure of a calf flashed near the fallen animal. The calf was rushing around its wounded mother, not understanding what was happening. A group with flashlights separated from the poacher's camp. They were on their way to retrieve their prey. I had less than a minute to make a decision. I couldn't call for help on the radio. The sound would give away my presence. An open confrontation with armed poachers at night was too risky, but I could not watch them kill a wounded animal in front of a cub. I quickly pulled out a signal cartridge, took aim, and shot in the opposite direction from the calves. A bright flash illuminated the forest, and somewhere in the crowns of the trees disturbed birds screamed. The poachers froze, then began to retreat quickly toward the vehicles. They obviously thought it was a raid. A flare is often used as a sign to start an operation. I could hear the engines starting. After waiting a few minutes for the sound of the engines to fade into the distance, I rushed over to the wounded muskox. She was alive, but the bullet had hit her hind leg. The cub, seeing me, jumped aside, but did not run far away. Maternal instinct kept it close to me. I quickly examined the wound. There was a lot of blood, but the arteries were intact. I took antiseptic and bandages out of the first aid kit. During the years of work in the reserve, I had to render first aid to wounded animals many times. The main thing was not to make any sudden movements and to speak in a calm, quiet voice. The muskox was surprisingly calm, perhaps from blood loss, or maybe she felt that I wanted to help. I treated the wound and applied a tight bandage. The bullet had gone through and through, which made things easier. The calf stood nearby, shuffling from foot to foot. It was dangerous to stay there. The poachers could return with reinforcements, but I could not abandon the wounded animal either. I remembered that 2 kilometers away there was an old cordon where I could hide and wait for help. The next hour and a half turned into a real ordeal. The muskox was able to walk, but slowly. Every few meters we had to stop and let her rest. The calf followed us at a distance. Once we heard the noise of a motor somewhere in the distance, and we froze in a thicket of young cedar until the sound died down. It was past midnight when we reached the cordon. I barricaded the door, renewed the bandage, and gave the animals water. Only then did I contact the central farmstead of the reserve. 3 hours later, a task force with a veterinarian arrived. The musk ox and calf were transported to the rehabilitation center. The wound was serious, but not fatal. A month later, they were released back into the reserve. A week later, the poachers were detained in another area. They were identified by the characteristic tire tracks. Later, my colleagues said that I had taken a big risk. Maybe. But at that moment, I thought of only one thing. We cannot allow the cub to remain an orphan. After all, we gamekeepers don't just protect territory. We protect life itself in all its forms. However, this story, for all its drama, turned out to be only a prelude to the events that unfolded in the winter of 2014. Back then, I had to face a situation where the price of a mistake was measured not only in animal lives, but also in human lives. The winter of 2014 forever changed my perception of the price one must sometimes pay for being faithful to duty. The events of those days still come back to me in nightmares. January 27th was particularly cold, with the thermometer reading -42 degrees Celsius. On such days, even experienced huntsmen prefer to stay on cordons. But Thomas Awitakira, my senior colleague and mentor, had a scheduled round of the outer section. He had worked in the reserve for over 20 years and knew the taiga like the back of his hand. "Only 6 hours on the route," he said over the radio in the morning. "I'll be home by 4. The weather is rough, but the route is familiar." That was the last conversation we had. At 4:30 p.m., when his connection dropped, I didn't think much of it. There's often interference in that area. But at 1800 hours, when Thomas did not contact me again, the first concern appeared. At 1900 hours, after the third attempt to contact, I realized something was wrong. I quickly assembled an emergency kit. Extra batteries for the flashlight, flares, warm blankets, a thermos with hot tea, and emergency supplies. The thermometer was already showing minus 45 degrees Celsius, and the weather forecasters promised further cooling. At such temperatures, a person without shelter can last no more than a few hours. At 7:30 p.m., I was already on the snowmobile. The headlights cut through the thickening darkness, the frost burning even through my mask. According to my calculations, Thomas had to pass through the tract of Medvedje and come out to the old clearing. This is the shortest way, but it is treacherous in winter. There are often ices under the snow. An hour later, I found the first tracks, a track covered with fresh snow. The direction coincided with the supposed route of Tomasa. Following along it, I reached the descent into the hollow. Here the track broke off. The beam of a flashlight picked out from the darkness the traces of a fall and a broken ski. A little farther away, there were distinctive marks in the snow, as if a man had tried to crawl. My heart clenched with a bad feeling. As I went lower, I saw him. Thomas was lying at the base of the slope, partially covered with snow. Unconscious, but alive, a faint breath formed a barely perceptible vapor in the lantern light. A backpack with a radio was lying nearby. It had shattered in the fall. Apparently, he had slipped on hidden ice, broken a ski, and seriously injured himself in the fall. Checked his pulse, weak but steady. Pupils were responsive to light. On examination, I found a severe head contusion and probably a broken leg, but the main enemy was frost. Thomas had been lying in the snow for several hours, and hypothermia was critical. Pulled out a sleeping bag, a thermal blanket, started rubbing his hands and face, unwrapped the thermal packs, stuffed them into his clothes. I radioed for emergency help, but the helicopter could not arrive in such weather. The nearest rescue team was 4 hours away. It was urgent to get Thomas at a warmth. The nearest shelter was an old winter house 3 kilometers away. Loading him onto the snowmobile was not an easy task. Every careless movement could aggravate his injuries. I fastened him with special straps, covered him with thermal packs, and started slow movement to the winter house. The ride seemed endless. Every bump, every unevenness made me cringe at the thought of the pain they were causing the wounded man. Thomas periodically regained consciousness, mumbling something about the bear tracks he had noticed before his fall. We reached the hut in an hour and a half. I heated the stove and prepared a bed. Thomas was in a semi-delirious state. His body temperature remained critically low. I did everything I had learned in first aid courses: rubs, hot drinks in small portions, constant monitoring of consciousness. 2 rescue teams made their way to us, but the weather continued to deteriorate. A blizzard began. Visibility dropped to a few meters. At one point, Thomas regained clear consciousness. He looked at me and quietly said, "I'm sorry, Victor. Sorry, Victor. I always told you to be careful." Those were his last words. An hour later, his heart stopped. Me and the guys from the rescue team, who got there only by morning, fought for his life for more than 3 hours. But the effects of the injuries and hypothermia were irreversible. Then there was the investigation, the official reports, the funeral. It turned out that Thomas had indeed discovered fresh tracks of a roach bear, later confirmed by the search party. He was in a hurry to warn everyone of the danger, and that hurry cost him his life. For a long time, I could not forgive myself for not insisting on canceling his rounds in such weather and not organizing a joint exit. I blame myself for not starting the search earlier, but over time I realized that there are no guarantees in our work. We make decisions based on experience and knowledge, but nature can always teach us a lesson, the price of which is life. After those events, I became a different person, more attentive to details, more cautious in my decisions. Now, when I go out on the route, I always remember Tomasa and the lessons he taught me over the years. His death showed me that the job of a gamekeeper is not just a service. It's a way of life where every day could be our last, but we still go out on the trail, because someone has to keep this harsh and beautiful world of wildlife safe. 7 years of working in the reserve have taught me a lot. Each of these stories has left its trace in my soul, changed me as a person and as a professional. Now, walking along familiar trails, I often stop at memorable places. Here we found lost hikers, there we encountered poachers, and on that slope we rescued a wounded musk deer with a calf. There is a modest memorial sign to Thomas Petrovich in the hollow near the bear tract, a simple wooden cross which we put up by the whole cordon. The taiga does not forgive mistakes and does not give indulgences, but it generously shares its wisdom with those who are ready to learn. Over the years, I have realized the main thing. Our work is not just a position or a profession. It is a calling. We do not just protect the territory, we preserve the whole world, ancient and infinitely complex, where everything is interconnected. Every morning, going out on the route, I know that this day can bring anything, from routine rounds to deadly danger. And each time, I make my choice anew to stay true to my duty, no matter the cost, because someone has to be the keeper of these woods. What do you think? Would you be able to leave your usual city life to work in the remote taiga? Are you ready to risk your life to protect nature? And most importantly, do you know any gamekeepers? Share their stories in the comments. Perhaps there are those among you who dream of connecting their lives with nature protection. Tell us what attracts you to this profession. What stories from the life of the reserve would you like to hear next time? If you like this story, please support the channel by liking and subscribing. There are many more amazing stories ahead about people who have dedicated their lives to protecting wildlife. See you in the next issues. And remember, we all have a choice, to be just an observer or to be a guardian of what we hold dear.